Picture a single candle flame trembling in the dark. It casts a pool of amber light across weathered stone, a surface carved by hands that turned to dust millennia ago. The flame dances, and shadows stretch and shrink along the wall, revealing edges and then hiding them again. In that flicker, hieroglyphs seem to move. Eyes painted 3,000 years ago watch from the periphery, appearing only when the light permits. This is how we see the ancient world. Not in full daylight, not with certainty, but in brief, golden moments, fragments illuminated by discovery, by excavation, by a single researcher's flashlight, in a tomb that has been sealed since the reign of pharaohs, whose names we can barely pronounce. The rest remains in shadow. Historians speak of timelines, of carbon dates and pottery styles, of royal genealogies stretching back to the first dynasty. But between those dates lie centuries of silence. Between those names, entire cultures rise and fall without leaving a single word behind. The candle shows us only what it can reach. Beyond its circle, the darkness is absolute. And in that darkness, anything might be hiding. Consider this: the Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the most studied structures in human history, was already ancient when Cleopatra walked the earth. More time separates her reign from the pyramid's construction than separates her from us. To the Greeks and Romans who marveled at it, the pyramid was as distant and mysterious as medieval cathedrals are to us now, perhaps more so. Yet we speak of ancient Egypt as if it were a single, unified age. We compress 4,000 years into a handful of dynasties, a dozen famous names, a few iconic monuments glowing in our collective memory like embers in the night. But what burned between those embers? What rose and fell in the spaces we cannot see? The truth is, history is not made of light. It is made of darkness briefly interrupted, a succession of candle flames, each one revealing a small patch of stone before guttering out. Some archaeologist uncovers a statue. Some linguist deciphers a text. Some geologist cores through sediment and finds pollen from a forest that grew when the Sahara was green. These are our candles. They show us moments, fragments, glimpses. But they also show us how much we're missing. This is a story about those missing pieces, about the gaps between the light, about what might be hidden in the shadows that stretch across deserts, beneath seas, under sand dunes that have swallowed entire cities without a whisper. It begins, as all journeys into the past must, with a question. What if the darkness holds more than we ever imagined? The conventional story goes like this. Around 3100 BCE, in the Fertile Crescent where the Nile spreads into a delta, a king named Narmer, or perhaps Menes, the sources disagree, unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. This marks year one of the first dynasty, the beginning of what we call civilization in the Nile Valley. Hieroglyphic writing appears. Monumental architecture begins. The age of the pharaohs is born. 1,000 miles to the northeast, in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians are already building cities Uruk, a redo with ziggurats rising above the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates. They inscribed cuneiform into wet clay, recording grain stores and temple offerings, contracts, and king lists. The earliest writing we possess. In Anatolia, small settlements grow into fortified towns. Pottery wheels spin. Copper is smelted. Trade routes stretch across mountains and deserts, connecting distant peoples who will never speak the same language, but who recognize the value of obsidian, lapis lazuli, and worked bronze. This is the framework we teach. The textbook narrative. The timeline that begins with hunter-gatherers, progresses through agricultural villages, and culminates in the first great civilizations Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, Bronze Age China. A story of linear ascent, of humanity climbing steadily from the Stone Age into history. But every story has its gaps. Between the lines of king lists and carbon-dated pottery, there are centuries where the record goes silent. Entire cultures that flourished and then vanished, leaving behind little more than scattered stones and the faintest traces in the soil. Pre-dynastic Egypt. For instance, the cultures that lived along the Nile before Narmer unified the two lands, left behind tombs and tools, pottery painted with boats and dancers, but almost no writing. Their languages are lost, their myths are lost. We know they existed because we find their graves, but we cannot hear their voices. And sometimes, we find things that do not quite fit the timeline. Stone circles in the Sahara that predate the pyramids by thousands of years. Megalithic temples in Malta, older than Stonehenge. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a site so ancient it was already buried and forgotten before the first Egyptian dynasty began, built by people who were not supposed to be capable of such monumental construction. These are not fringe discoveries. They are mainstream archaeology sites excavated, dated, published in peer-reviewed journals. Yet they complicate the narrative. They suggest that the path from hunter-gatherer to pyramid builder was not as straightforward as we once believed. Memory, it turns out, is an unreliable keeper of the past. Oral traditions preserve fragments, flood stories, tales of ancient kings, myths of gods who descended from the stars. But oral tradition is fluid. It changes with each retelling, adapting to new audiences, blending with other stories, losing details that no longer seem relevant. Within a few generations, history becomes legend. Within a few more, legend becomes myth. And myth, eventually, becomes dismissed as mere fantasy. Yet sometimes, myth contains a kernel of truth. The Greeks believed that Egypt was impossibly old, that its priests kept records stretching back tens of thousands of years. Herodotus, visiting in the 5th century BCE, wrote that the Egyptians told him their civilization had existed for over 11,000 years. Modern scholars dismiss this as exaggeration, priestly boasting designed to impress a foreign visitor. But what if the priests were not speaking of dynasties and pharaohs? What if they were speaking of something older, something that came before? The desert keeps its secrets well. Sand buries cities. Wind erodes inscriptions. Stone cracks and crumbles under the relentless pressure of millennia. What survives is only what was built to last: granite and basalt, deep foundations, tombs sealed against time. Everything else disappears. Wood rots, papyrus disintegrates, mud brick melts back into the earth. Entire chapters of history can be lost simply because they were written in materials too fragile to endure. And so we are left with sand, stone, and memory. The sand covers what it will. The stone endures, silent and inscrutable. And memory, fragmented, distorted, half-forgotten whispers that there is more to the story than we have been told. But to hear that whisper, we must venture beyond the familiar monuments, beyond the well-lit halls of museums and the confident assertions of textbooks. We must step into the shadows, where the candle's light barely reaches, and ask questions that have no easy answers. We must begin with Egypt, not the Egypt of golden masks and painted tombs, but the Egypt that existed in the half-light before history began. Long before the pyramids rose above the desert, the Nile was already shaping a civilization. The river flows north, a ribbon of life through one of the harshest landscapes on earth, carrying water and silt from the highlands of equatorial Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. Every year, like clockwork, it floods. The waters rise, spill over the banks, and blanket the floodplain in rich, black mud. When they recede, they leave behind soil so fertile that farmers need only scatter seed to ensure a harvest. This is the gift of the Nile: predictable, reliable, sustaining. It is what allowed early communities to settle, to grow grain, to accumulate surplus, to support artisans and priests and kings. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt, just desert, just stone and sand stretching to every horizon. The people who first came to the river were not Egyptians as we know them. They were Neolithic pastoralists and hunter-gatherers, drawn from the surrounding deserts as the climate shifted and the once green Sahara began to dry. They built simple villages along the riverbanks, buried their dead in shallow graves, and left behind pottery decorated with geometric patterns and images of wild animals. By 4000 BCE, these scattered communities had begun to coalesce into distinct cultures: Badarian, Nakada, Mahdi, each with its own pottery styles, burial customs, and trade networks. They had no writing, no centralized government, no monumental architecture, but they were not primitive. They worked copper and gold. They carved intricate stone vessels from hard basalt and diorite. They built boats and sailed the Nile, carrying goods and ideas from one settlement to another. This is pre-dynastic Egypt, a shadowy prelude to the civilization we recognize. Then, around 3100 BCE, something changes. The villages consolidate into two kingdoms: Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north. A king emerges, conquers, unifies. Writing appears almost overnight, fully formed, with a complex system of hieroglyphs that seems to have no evolutionary precursor. Monumental architecture begins: mastaba tombs, ceremonial complexes, early temples. Within a few generations, the Egyptians are building on a scale that defies explanation. Massive stone structures aligned with astronomical precision, executed with a level of craftsmanship that will not be surpassed for millennia. It is a sudden flowering, almost miraculous in its speed, and it raises an uncomfortable question. Where did it all come from? The mainstream answer is gradual development, centuries of incremental advances that culminate in the explosive creativity of the early dynastic period. But the archaeological record shows us villages and pottery, not prototypes of pyramids. It shows us copper tools and reed boats, not evidence of an infrastructure capable of quarrying, transporting, and lifting multi-ton blocks of stone. There is a gap, a missing chapter. Some researchers suggest that the answer lies in the delta, the marshy lowlands where the Nile empties into the sea. This region, they argue, may have been the birthplace of Egyptian civilization, a place where early experiments in writing, architecture, and governance took place. But the delta is also one of the most geologically unstable regions in Egypt. Sediment builds up, rivers shift course, sea levels rise and fall. Anything built there more than 5,000 years ago is now buried under meters of silt or submerged beneath the Mediterranean. If there were earlier experiments in stone, earlier attempts at monumental construction, they may be lost forever. But there are hints. On the Giza Plateau, west of modern Cairo, 3 massive pyramids dominate the skyline monuments to the 4th dynasty pharaohs Khufu, Khafor, and Menkaure. These are the pyramids that define Egypt in the popular imagination, the ones that appear on postcards and travel brochures, the ones that have stood for 45 centuries and will likely stand for 45 more. Yet even here, in the most studied archaeological site in the world, there are anomalies. The Great Pyramid itself, Khufu's tomb, according to tradition, contains no inscriptions, no decorations, no definitive proof of who built it or when. The attribution to Khufu rests largely on a few cartouches found in relieving chambers above the king's chamber, marks that some researchers argue could have been added later or misinterpreted. The construction techniques required to build it, the precision of the alignment, the interlocking of the stones, the internal passages, and chambers are not found in earlier pyramids and are never replicated in later ones. It is as if the 4th dynasty reached a peak of architectural mastery and then forgot how they did it. And then there is the Sphinx, crouched at the edge of the plateau, gazing eastward toward the rising sun. The Great Sphinx is carved from a single outcrop of limestone, a leonine body with a human head eroded and weathered, its features softened by millennia of wind and sand. The conventional dating places it in the reign of Khafor, around 2500 BCE, carved at the same time as the Second Pyramid. But the Sphinx does not look like the other monuments of the 4th dynasty. Its proportions are strange head too small for the body, as if recarved from an earlier form. Its weathering is inconsistent deep vertical fissures in the enclosure walls that do not match the horizontal wind erosion seen elsewhere on the plateau. And then there is the question of water, which brings us to the edge of something far more unsettling, a possibility that the Sphinx, and perhaps other monuments we attribute to the pharaohs, may have origins that stretch back into a time before Egypt was Egypt, a time when the desert was not yet a desert, a time when rain fell on the Nile Valley. Stand in the Sphinx enclosure on a January morning before the tour buses arrive, and you will notice something strange. The walls around the Sphinx are not smooth. They are scored and furrowed, grooved by deep vertical channels that run from top to bottom, as if massive amounts of water once poured over them. Some of these channels are more than a meter deep, carved into the limestone over what must have been centuries, perhaps millennia, of relentless weathering. But this is the Sahara. It does not rain here, not in any meaningful sense. A few millimeters per year, perhaps barely enough to dampen the sand. Certainly not enough to carve deep channels into solid rock. This is the anomaly that has puzzled geologists and sparked one of the most contentious debates in Egyptology, the question of the Sphinx's true age. The conventional view, accepted by the vast majority of archaeologists, is straightforward. The Sphinx was carved during the reign of Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid at Giza, around 2500 BCE. Evidence includes the stylistic similarity between the Sphinx's heavily eroded face and statues of Khafre, the proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's pyramid complex, and a stela placed between the Sphinx's paws by the pharaoh Thutmose IV in 1400 BCE, which some interpret as referring to Khafre as the monument's creator. This is the story told in textbooks, museums, and documentaries. The Sphinx is 4,500 years old ancient, but comfortably within the timeline of dynastic Egypt. But then there is the weathering. In the early 1990s, a Boston University geologist named Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx and its enclosure and reached a startling conclusion. The erosion patterns were not consistent with wind and sand. They were consistent with water, specifically prolonged exposure to rainfall and surface runoff. Schoch pointed out that other structures on the Giza Plateau, including the pyramids and tombs definitively dated to the Old Kingdom, show horizontal wind erosion, the kind of weathering you would expect in a desert environment. But the Sphinx enclosure shows vertical weathering, the kind produced by water flowing over stone. And the last time the Giza Plateau experienced sustained rainfall was at the end of the last ice age, between 10,000 and 5,000 BC, thousands of years before the pharaohs. The implications are staggering. If Schoch is correct, the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It is at least 7,000 years old, possibly older, carved during a wetter climate by a culture that predates dynastic Egypt by millennia. This would mean that the Sphinx stood on the Giza Plateau long before the pyramids were built, weathering under centuries of rain, slowly eroding, until the climate shifted and the desert encroached, and the monument was buried up to its neck in sand, waiting to be rediscovered by the pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty. It would mean that the Egyptians did not build the Sphinx. They inherited it. The response from mainstream Egyptology was swift and dismissive. Critics argued that Schoch had misinterpreted the geology, that the erosion could be explained by other factors: groundwater seepage, dew, even the poor quality of the limestone itself, which weathers differently in different layers. They pointed out that there is no archaeological evidence of a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx before 3000 BCE. No tools, no settlements, no pottery, nothing to suggest that anyone was building monumental sculpture on the Giza Plateau in 7000 BCE. And this is where the debate becomes philosophical as much as scientific. Absence of evidence, the saying goes, is not evidence of absence. Just because we have not found remains of a pre-dynastic culture advanced enough to carve the Sphinx does not mean such a culture did not exist. The archaeological record is notoriously incomplete. Entire civilizations can vanish if they built in wood, if they lived in regions that were later flooded or buried, if their settlements were overwritten by later construction. Consider this. We only discovered Göbekli Tepe, an 11,600-year-old megalithic site in Turkey that completely upended our understanding of prehistoric societies, 1994. Before that, scholars confidently asserted that hunter-gatherers were incapable of monumental architecture. Then we found stone circles and T-shaped pillars, carved with animals, built by people who had not yet domesticated plants or animals, and the entire timeline of human development had to be revised. What else might we be missing? The Sphinx keeps its secrets. It sits in its enclosure, eroded and enigmatic, its face gazing toward the eastern horizon where the sun rises each morning, as it has for thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years. If it could speak, what would it tell us? What did it witness in the millennia before the first hieroglyph was carved, before the first pyramid stone was laid? We may never know, but the erosion remains. The vertical channels in the enclosure walls remain. And the question remains, hanging in the air like dust caught in the light of a flickering candle. What if the stone remembers rain? In 1933, a French military patrol was crossing the western desert of Egypt, somewhere between the Nile and the Libyan border, when they stumbled upon something impossible. Lying half buried in the sand, miles from any oasis, any river, any body of water at all, was the hull of a Roman ship. Not a small boat. A full-sized merchant galley, its wooden ribs bleached white by the sun, its planking cracked and splintered, but still recognizable. There were oars. There were clay amphory storage jars used for wine and olive oil, some still intact. There were coins bearing the profile of a Roman emperor, long dead, but there was no water. The desert had swallowed it, this vessel that had once sailed the Mediterranean, carrying goods from Alexandria or Carthage or Rome itself, now resting in a sea of sand, surrounded by nothing but dunes stretching to the horizon. No one knows how it got there. Perhaps it was part of a convoy crossing the desert on sledges, and a sandstorm separated it from the others. Perhaps it was abandoned during a military expedition. Perhaps it was wrecked in a flash flood. Yes, even the Sahara has flash floods, brief and violent, filling dry wadis with torrents that disappear within hours. Or perhaps, thousands of years ago, the desert was not quite so dry. The point is this: the Sahara is a graveyard. It preserves what it swallows. Mummies, pottery, tools, entire villages buried beneath the dunes, waiting for the wind to shift and expose them again. A Roman ship is strange, but not unique. Archaeologists have found evidence of ancient lakes, rivers, forests, ecosystems that thrived when the climate was different, when rain fell and grass grew, and herds of antelope grazed where now there is only sand. If a Roman ship can survive in the desert for 2,000 years, what else might be hidden there? What might be waiting beneath the dunes, buried not for centuries, but for millennia, from a time before the desert was a desert at all? The Sahara is vast. It is largely unexplored, and it is very, very good at keeping secrets. Imagine the Nile Valley in 5000 BCE. The river flows, as it always has, but the landscape around it is different. The desert has not yet fully claimed the land. To the west, where the Sahara now stretches endlessly, there are grasslands dotted with acacia trees, shallow lakes fed by seasonal rains, herds of wild cattle and gazelle moving across the savanna. To the east, the Red Sea hills are greener, less barren, veined with wadis that carry water during the wet season. Along the Nile itself, small communities have begun to settle farming villages built of mud brick and reed, surrounded by fields of emmer wheat and barley. These people are not yet Egyptians. They have no writing, No centralized authority, no concept of themselves as a unified culture. They are simply people living along a river, growing food, raising children, burying their dead in oval graves lined with matting, facing west toward the setting sun. But they are not primitive. They work stone with remarkable skill, not just flint for arrowheads and knives, but hard stones like diorite and basalt, which they carve into bowls and vessels with thin walls and polished surfaces. This is not easy. Basalt is nearly as hard as granite. It cannot be shaped with copper tools. It requires abrasives, sand, water, patience, and an understanding of the stone's grain, its weaknesses, the way it fractures under pressure. These pre-dynastic craftsmen possessed that understanding. They also built boats reed vessels at first, lashed together with rope, later wooden boats with planks sewn together and sealed with pitch. They sailed the Nile, north and south, carrying goods and ideas. Shells from the Red Sea appear in graves in Upper Egypt. Pottery styles spread from the Delta to Aswan. Trade routes emerge, connecting distant communities, creating networks of exchange that will eventually form the foundation of a unified state. And they carved stone. Not monuments, not yet, but stelae, standing stones, markers placed at sacred sites or graves. Some are decorated with simple images, animals, boats, human figures. Others are left blank, their surfaces smoothed and shaped, as if the act of shaping the stone itself held meaning. This is the culture that preceded the pharaohs, the Naqada culture, named for a village in Upper Egypt where the first graves were excavated. They flourished between 4000 and 3000 BCE, gradually growing more complex, more organized, until finally, in a process that remains poorly understood, they coalesced into the state we call Egypt. But there are hints that Naqada itself inherited traditions from even earlier cultures. Deep in the western desert, at a place called Nabta Playa, archaeologists have found something extraordinary: a stone circle. Not a natural formation, but a deliberately constructed arrangement of megalith standing stones in flat slabs, placed upright in a pattern aligned with the cardinal directions and the summer solstice. Beneath the stones, they found the remains of cattle burials, pottery, tools. The site is dated to around 5000 BCE, 1,000 years before the first pyramids, 2,000 years before the first hieroglyphs. Who built it? Not the Egyptians, not the Naqada people, but pastoralists, herders who lived in the Sahara when it was still green, who gathered at Nabta Playa during the rainy season, who watched the stars and marked the passage of the year with stone. These people had no writing, no cities, no bronze. Yet they understood astronomy. They understood geometry. They understood how to move and position multi-ton stones with precision. And when the climate shifted, when the rains failed and the Sahara began to dry, they did not simply vanish. They migrated. They moved east toward the Nile, bringing their knowledge with them, knowledge of the stars, of stone, of the deep rhythms of the natural world. Is it possible that the sudden flowering of Egyptian civilization, the rapid development of writing, architecture, and statecraft was not spontaneous but inherited? That the Egyptians were the heirs to a much older tradition, one that had no written records, but was passed down through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through the slow accumulation of knowledge over generations? There is no direct proof, but there are tantalizing clues. The Egyptians themselves believed their culture was ancient. Their mythology speaks of a time before the pharaohs, a time when the gods ruled directly, when the world was younger and knowledge flowed more freely. The pyramid texts carved into the walls of Old Kingdom. Tombs reference rituals and cosmologies that seem to predate the pyramids themselves, as if the priests were preserving traditions whose origins had been forgotten. And then there is the stonework. The early dynasties produced some of the finest stone architecture in Egyptian history. The step pyramid of Djoser, built around 2650 BCE, is made of small, carefully fitted blocks, but it is crude compared to what comes later. The Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid, and finally the Great Pyramid, each a leap forward in scale and precision. But then, something strange happens. After the 4th dynasty, the quality declines. 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids are smaller, built with inferior materials, prone to collapse. The knowledge seems to fade. It is as if the peak of Egyptian architectural achievement occurred early, and everything afterward is a slow descent, an attempt to recapture something that was only briefly grasped. What if the 4th dynasty builders were not inventing techniques, but rediscovering them? What if they had access to knowledge passed down from earlier times, knowledge that was incomplete, fragmentary, but just sufficient to build Giza before it was lost again? We will never know for certain. But the desert whispers, the stones whisper, and if we listen carefully, we might hear echoes of a time before Egypt was Egypt, a time when the Sahara was green, when rain fell on the Nile Valley, and when people who left no names carved stone and watched the stars and laid the foundations for everything that would come after. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood on a hill in southeastern Turkey, surveying a landscape of dry grassland and scattered stones. Local shepherds had long known about the place Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, and had occasionally unearthed carved stones while digging fence posts. No one thought much of it. Turkey is littered with ancient ruins. Another old site, perhaps a medieval cemetery. Nothing unusual. Then Schmidt began to dig. What he found beneath the surface rewrote human history. Göbekli Tepe is not a cemetery. It is a complex of megalithic enclosure circular structures built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in rings and carved with intricate reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures, serpents. The craftsmanship is astonishing. The pillars are shaped with precision, their surfaces smooth and decorated, their tops carved into abstract representations of human form: shoulders, arms, hands. But the most astonishing thing about Göbekli Tepe is its age. Radiocarbon dating places the oldest structures at around 9600 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. This makes Göbekli Tepe older than pottery, older than agriculture, older than the wheel. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids by 7,000 years. And it was built by hunter-gatherers. This is what shook archaeology to its core. The traditional model of human development goes like this. First, people learned to farm. Agriculture allowed them to settle in one place, to accumulate surplus, to support specialized laborers, artisans, priests, builders. This led to villages, then towns, then cities. Monumental architecture came later, as societies grew more complex and gained the resources to organize large-scale construction projects. But Göbekli Tepe inverts that sequence. The people who built it were not farmers. They lived by hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. They had no cities, no writing, no bronze tools. Yet they quarried multi-ton stones from bedrock, transported them across rough terrain, erected them in precise geometric patterns, and carved them with astonishing skill. How? And more importantly, why? Schmidt believed that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual center, a place where scattered groups of hunter-gatherers gathered periodically for ceremonies, feasts, and communal construction projects. The animal carvings suggest symbolic or totemic significance, perhaps representing clans or spiritual beliefs. The lack of any residential structures or evidence of daily life suggests that no one lived there permanently. It was a destination, a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to participate in something larger than themselves. And then, after perhaps 1,000 years of use, they buried it, deliberately, carefully, filling in the enclosures with rubble and soil, entombing the pillars, covering the entire site so thoroughly that it remained hidden for 10 millennia. Why would they do that? No one knows. But Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across southern Turkey, archaeologists have since discovered dozens of similar sites: Karahan Tepe, Harbitsuvin Tepe, Sefer Tepe, all dating to roughly the same period, all featuring T-shaped pillars and animal carvings, all built by pre-agricultural societies. It suggests a widespread culture, a shared belief system, a level of social organization that should not exist according to our models of prehistory. And it forces us to ask, if hunter-gatherers in Turkey could build Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BCE, what were people in Egypt doing at the same time? The answer, according to mainstream archaeology, is not much. Living in small bands, following herds, leaving behind little more than stone tools and scattered campsites. The Nile Valley was sparsely populated. The Sahara was in transition, drying out after the last ice age. Civilization was still thousands of years away. But Göbekli Tepe teaches us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We did not find Göbekli Tepe until 1994, despite the fact that it is one of the largest megalithic sites in the world. It was hidden in plain sight, buried by its own builders, waiting to be rediscovered. How many other sites remain hidden? How many lie beneath desert sands, beneath Mediterranean waves, beneath modern cities and farmland? The timeline we once accepted as fixed, the neat progression from Stone Age to Bronze Age, from hunter-gatherers to city builders, has been shaken. We now know that human societies were far more capable, far earlier than we ever imagined. And if people in Turkey could organize and build on such a scale in 9600 BCE, is it so implausible to suggest that people in Egypt might have done the same? The Nile Valley had water, it had game, it had resources. It had people who, like all humans, looked up at the night sky and wondered, who buried their dead with care, who created art and ritual and meaning. Is it so impossible to imagine that they, too, built in stone monuments that were later buried, eroded, repurposed, or simply forgotten, leaving only the faintest traces for us to find? We stand at the edge of a new understanding, peering into a past that grows deeper and stranger with every discovery. Göbekli Tepe is the candle flame that illuminates a previously dark corner of prehistory, but it also shows us how much darkness still remains. There is a granite box in the Cairo Museum, a simple rectangular container, unadorned, with a lid that fits so precisely you can barely slip a piece of paper between the edge and the rim. It was found in the burial chamber beneath the pyramid of Kafur at Giza. Archaeologists call it a sarcophagus, though no body was ever found inside. The box is carved from a single block of red Aswan granite, one of the hardest stones in Egypt, a material so dense that modern stoneworkers use diamond-tipped saws to cut it. Yet the ancient Egyptians, working with copper tools, managed to hollow out this box, smooth its interior surfaces to near-perfect flatness, and create corners so sharp they could cut your finger. How? This is one of the great mysteries of Egyptian stonework. The conventional answer goes like this. The Egyptians used copper saws and drills, along with abrasive sand, to cut and shape hard stone. They would dip the copper tools in wet sand quartz grains, acting as the cutting agent, and then saw or drill back and forth, slowly grinding through the stone. It required immense patience, enormous amounts of labor, and a steady supply of copper tools that wore out quickly and had to be replaced. This explanation is repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and museum placards. It is the mainstream view, supported by experimental archaeology and the discovery of ancient copper tools at quarry sites. But it raises uncomfortable questions. First, the mathematics. A single granite sarcophagus requires hundreds, perhaps thousands of hours of labor to produce. The interior of the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid contains one such sarcophagus. The pyramid complex as a whole includes dozens of similar pieces, granite beams, lintels, plugs, each requiring the same painstaking process. If we accept that all of this was done with copper and sand, we must also accept that the Egyptians devoted staggering amounts of time and resources to tasks that, frankly, seem inefficient. Why use granite at all when limestone is far easier to work? Why create such precision when rough-cut blocks would serve the same structural purpose? Second, the precision. Modern engineers who have examined Egyptian stonework note that some pieces exhibit tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter flatness, and parallelism that rivals modern machining. The granite blocks in the king's chamber, for instance, are fitted so tightly that you cannot slide a razor blade between them. Could copper tools and sand really achieve that level of precision? And then there are the drill marks. At Giza, at Abu Rawash, at Saqqara, you can find granite blocks with circular drill holes, some shallow, some deep, some spiraling into the stone with a uniform pitch that suggests rapid penetration. These are not rough, hand-drilled holes. They are smooth, evenly spaced, and some show spiral grooves, indicating that the drill was cutting through granite at a rate of several millimeters per rotation. This is where alternative theories begin to emerge. Some researchers argue that the Egyptians possessed techniques we have not yet rediscovered, perhaps harder alloys, perhaps mechanical advantages like weighted drill presses, perhaps chemical methods of softening stone. There are references in ancient texts to secret knowledge held by temple priests, to techniques passed down through mystery schools, and guilds, techniques that were lost when those institutions collapsed. Others suggest something more radical, that the most precise stonework predates the dynastic Egyptians entirely, that the 4th dynasty builders inherited some of these pieces sarcophagi, granite beams, even entire structures, and repurposed them. That the Egyptians were master builders, yes, but also master salvagers, reusing materials from an earlier, forgotten age. There is precedent for this. Ancient peoples frequently reused older monuments. The Romans pillaged Egyptian obelisks to decorate their own cities. Medieval Europeans quarried stone from Roman ruins to build cathedrals. The Egyptians themselves dismantled pyramids to build later ones. Why not reuse earlier work? But if we accept this possibility, we must also ask, who were the earlier stoneworkers? There is no archaeological evidence of a pre-dynastic culture capable of such craftsmanship. No tools, no quarries, no inscriptions. Just the stones themselves, silent and enigmatic, their origins lost. Unless, of course, we are looking in the wrong places. The Nile Delta, as mentioned earlier, is a shifting, sediment-choked region where evidence of early settlement could easily be buried under meters of alluvial deposits. The deserts west and east of the Nile were once more hospitable. Perhaps settlements existed there, settlements that were abandoned when the climate dried and the sands encroached. And then there is the possibility, however remote, that some of this knowledge came from outside Egypt entirely. Ancient Egypt was not isolated. It traded with Nubia to the south, with the Levant to the northeast, with Mesopotamia, Anatolia. Even some argue with cultures as far away as the Indus Valley. Ideas traveled with goods. Techniques were shared, adapted, refined. Perhaps the stone-cutting mastery we see at Giza is not purely Egyptian in origin, but a synthesis of knowledge from multiple sources, brought together by traders, craftsmen, and immigrants who came to the Nile Valley from distant lands. We may never know. What we do know is this: the stones exist. They are real, measurable, undeniable, and they challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about the capabilities of ancient peoples, not just the Egyptians, but all the cultures that came before, whose names are lost, whose monuments are buried, but whose handiwork endures in the hardest, most stubborn material on earth. Stone, after all, is patient. It outlasts kings, outlasts kingdoms, outlasts memory itself. And sometimes it is the only witness to ages so remote that even legend has forgotten them. In the 1880s, the English Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie conducted a meticulous survey of the Giza Plateau. Petrie was an obsessive measurer. He documented everything: pyramid angles, block dimensions, tool marks, the width of joints between stones. His notebooks are filled with precise sketches and measurements, many of which remain the standard reference for Egyptologists today. But one detail puzzled him more than any other. In the granite blocks around the pyramids, Petrie observed drill-hole circular bores cut into the stone, some several inches deep. What caught his attention was the spiral groove left inside these holes, a helical marking that indicated the drill had cut downward in a continuous spiral, penetrating the granite at an astonishing rate. Petrie measured the pitch of the spiral and calculated that the drill was advancing at a rate of 1/10 of an inch per revolution, far faster than any known ancient tool should have been able to achieve. He wrote, "The grooves show that the drill was cutting into the granite at a rate that is impossible with hand tools and abrasives alone. Modern attempts to replicate these drill marks using copper tools and sand have struggled to match the speed and uniformity. Even with power tools, achieving the same precision requires careful calibration and modern drill bits. So how did the Egyptians do it? The mainstream view is that they used some form of weighted drill, perhaps a bow drill with a heavy stone or metal weight attached, and that the grooves are simply the cumulative result of hours or days of labor. But Petrie's measurements suggest otherwise, that the drill was cutting continuously, not grinding slowly. Alternative researchers have proposed various explanations: hardened bronze alloys, diamond-tipped drills, even ultrasonic drilling techniques. None of these theories are widely accepted, largely because there is no archaeological evidence for such advanced tools in ancient Egypt. Yet the drill marks remain. They are not isolated examples. They appear at multiple sites, across different dynasties, in both limestone and granite. They are physical evidence of a technique that, to this day, we do not fully understand. And they remind us that the ancient world was not always less capable than we assume. Sometimes it was more capable. Close your eyes and imagine the night sky as it appeared 15,000 years ago. The same stars, but in different positions. The constellations we know, Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, shifted slightly, rotated by the slow wobble of Earth's axis known as precession. The Milky Way arches overhead, brighter than it has any right to be, unsoftened by city lights or atmospheric pollution. In the desert, with no moon, the galaxy is so vivid it casts faint shadows. This is the sky the Ice Age people saw. And beneath that sky, the Nile Valley was a different world. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the last Ice Age, occurred around 20,000 BCE. Ice sheets covered much of Europe and North America. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, exposing vast stretches of continental shelf. The climate was cooler, drier, more volatile. But Egypt, being near the equator, was not frozen. It was, however, transformed. The Nile still flowed, fed by rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands, but its volume was reduced. The surrounding deserts were even more arid than they are now. Yet paradoxically, the air was cooler, the nights colder, and moisture patterns were different. Some areas that are now barren may have had seasonal water sources, ephemeral lakes, wadis that flowed briefly after rare rains. And in the Sahara, during certain periods of the late Ice Age and immediately afterward, the climate shifted dramatically. Around 10,000 BCE, as the glaciers melted and global temperatures rose, the African monsoon strengthened. Rains returned to North Africa, transforming the Sahara into a mosaic of grasslands, savannas, and shallow lakes. This period, known as the African Humid Period, lasted for several thousand years, creating an environment capable of supporting large populations of humans and animals. This is when people began to move. Hunter-gatherers who had clung to refuges during the arid millennia of the Ice Age now spread across the greening Sahara, following herds of wild cattle, antelope, and gazelle. They fished in lakes that have since vanished. They gathered wild grains along riverbanks. They built seasonal camps, carved rock art into cliff faces, and eventually began to experiment with herding and cultivation. And they watched the stars. For people living without artificial light, without clocks or calendars, the sky was the primary tool for tracking time. The stars marked the seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, when to move to summer pastures or winter shelters. The heliacal rising of certain stars, their first appearance in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility, signaled the beginning of the Nile flood, the most important event in the Egyptian agricultural calendar. This knowledge, this intimate familiarity with celestial cycles, was not invented by the dynastic Egyptians. It was inherited. The same constellations that the Egyptians later codified into their mythology, Orion as Osiris, Sirius as Isis, the northern circumpolar stars as the imperishable ones, were observed and tracked by earlier cultures. The alignment of temples and pyramids with cardinal directions, with solstices and equinoxes, with specific stars, reflects a tradition of astronomical observation stretching back millennia. But here is where things become speculative. Some researchers argue that certain monuments encode not just simple alignments, but precise knowledge of precession, the 26,000-year cycle in which Earth's axis slowly wobbles like a spinning top, causing the position of the stars to drift over time. If true, this would imply that the builders understood cycles spanning tens of thousands of years. The mainstream view is skeptical. Precession is a subtle effect, requiring generations of careful observation to detect. It is possible that the Egyptians noticed it, but there is no direct written evidence that they understood it as a cosmic cycle. Yet myths from around the world hint at deep time ages of the world, great cycles of creation and destruction, floods and rebirths. The Hindu concept of yugas, the Greek idea of ages of man, the Mayan long count calendar all, suggest an awareness that time operates on scales far longer than a human lifetime. Could these myths preserve fragments of astronomical knowledge passed down from the Ice Age? There is no proof, only possibilities. But when you stand in the Sahara on a moonless night, looking up at the same stars that Ice Age hunters saw, you feel the weight of time. You realize how much has been forgotten, how many cultures rose and fell, how many stories were told and lost, how many voices fell silent long before anyone thought to write them down. The sky remembers, the stars remain, and if we learn to read them correctly, they might tell us things we never imagined. There is a layer of sediment in the geological record that tells a story of catastrophe. It appears in ice cores drilled from Greenland glaciers, in lake bed deposits across Europe and North America, in ocean sediments from the Atlantic. The layer dates to around 10,800 BC, the beginning of a climatic period known as the Younger Dryas. The name comes from a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly reappears in the sediment record during this time, indicating a dramatic return to Ice Age conditions. For more than 1,000 years, just as the world was warming and the glaciers were retreating, temperatures plunged again. Ice advanced, forests died, lakes froze. And then, just as abruptly, it ended. By 9600 BCE, temperatures shot back up. The ice melted rapidly, catastrophically, in some regions. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose by dozens of meters over the course of centuries. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves. This is not speculation. This is established geological fact, accepted by climate scientists worldwide. But here is what makes it relevant to our story. People lived through this. Entire cultures experienced the Younger Dryas, adapted to its frigid conditions, and then watched their world transform as the ice melted and the seas rose. What happened to them? In most cases, we do not know. The archaeological record for this period is frustratingly sparse. Hunter-gatherer populations leave light footprints, no cities, No monumental architecture, no writing. What survives are stone tools, occasional campsites, scattered bones. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Consider the North American Clovis culture, named after distinctive spear points found across the continent. The Clovis people were skilled hunters who thrived during the late Ice Age, tracking mammoths and mastodons across a landscape of tundra and grassland. And, around 10,800 BCE, they vanished. Their distinctive tool styles disappear from the archaeological record, replaced by different cultures with different technologies. What happened? Did they die out? Migrate? Adapt? For decades, archaeologists debated whether climate change, overhunting, or disease caused their disappearance. Recently, some researchers have proposed a more dramatic explanation: an extraterrestrial impact. They point to a thin layer of carbon-rich sediment, along with microscopic diamonds and other materials consistent with a cosmic airburst or impact, dated precisely to the beginning of the Younger Dryas. The theory is controversial, not universally accepted, but it raises a chilling possibility that the Younger Dryas was not a gradual climatic shift, but a catastrophic event, a comet or asteroid impact that triggered wildfires, atmospheric darkening, and abrupt cooling. If true, entire populations could have been wiped out in a matter of years or decades. Now consider the same scenario in other parts of the world. In the Near East, in North Africa, in coastal regions around the Mediterranean, people lived during the Younger Dryas. Some survived by retreating to refuges, river valleys, oases, caves. Others may have perished. And when the climate warmed again, when the seas rose and the landscape transformed, the survivors emerged into a world that looked nothing like the one their ancestors had known. Coastlines were gone. River courses had shifted. Lakes had dried up or filled in. Entire ecosystems had been rearranged. Any settlements, any monuments, any traces of culture that existed along the old coastlines were now underwater, submerged beneath tens of meters of seawater, buried under sediment, lost to history. This is why some researchers argue that we are looking for the origins of civilization in the wrong places. We search inland, in river valleys and deserts, because that is where the surviving evidence is. But during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, the most fertile, resource-rich land was along the coasts on continental shelves that are now submerged. If advanced cultures existed before the Younger Dryas, they would likely have been concentrated in these coastal zones. And when the ice melted and the seas rose, those cultures would have been inundated. Their cities, if they had cities, would be underwater. Their fields, their ports, their monuments would lie beneath the waves, in depths too great for ancient looters or medieval treasure hunters to reach, slowly being buried under sediment, waiting for modern technology to find them. This is not wild speculation. We have already found submerged settlements. Off the coast of India, underwater surveys have located stone structures in the Gulf of Kanhat, dated by some researchers to 7,500 BCE or earlier, though the findings remain disputed. In the Mediterranean, the ancient cities of Heracleion and Canopus, once thriving ports near Alexandria, now lie submerged, discovered only in the year 2000. These were historical cities, known from texts, simply reclaimed by the sea due to subsidence and rising water levels. But if historical cities can disappear so completely, what about prehistoric ones? What about settlements that existed before writing, before recorded history, in the fertile coastal zones of the Ice Age world? They would leave almost no trace. No texts to describe them. No later cultures to remember them. Just stone, if they built in stone, slowly breaking apart under the pressure of water and time. And myths. Always there are myths. Flood stories appear in nearly every ancient culture. The Sumerians told of Ziusudra, who survived a deluge sent by the gods. The Hebrews told of Noah. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion. The Hindus preserved the tale of Manu. indigenous Australians recount stories of the sea swallowing the land. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as religious allegory, moral fables, symbolic narratives. But in recent decades, geologists have begun to take them seriously, not as literal history, but as cultural memories of real climatic events. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, they did not rise uniformly. In some places, the change was gradual, almost imperceptible. In others, it was rapid and catastrophic ice dams breaking, glacial lakes draining, entire coastlines flooding within a generation. People who lived through such events would have remembered. They would have told stories. And those stories, passed down through oral tradition, would have evolved into myths exaggerated, embellished, infused with divine actors and supernatural elements, but preserving at their core a memory of catastrophic flooding. If this is true, then the flood myths are not fantasies. They are history, distorted by time but rooted in real events. And if civilizations were lost to those floods, we should not be surprised that we have not found them. We have only just begun to search. In the oral traditions of the Yiniji people of northeastern Australia, there is a story. It tells of a time when the shoreline was farther out, when people could walk to places that are now islands, when the land extended beyond where the ocean now breaks. For generations, anthropologists dismissed such stories as vague mythology, poetic descriptions of a dream time that existed outside of historical time. Then, in the 1990s, a linguist named Nicholas Redd began collaborating with geologists to map ancient coastlines around the Australian continent. Using sea level data, they determined that the stories matched real geography. Approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, sea levels were lower around Australia, and many areas that are now underwater were dry land. The details in the Aboriginal stories' specific landmarks, islands that were once connected to the mainland, bays that were once dry valleys corresponded to coastlines that existed at the end of the ice age. These stories had been passed down orally, generation after generation, for at least 7,000 years. 7,000 years of oral tradition, preserving accurate geographical information without any written records. This discovery forced scholars to reconsider the reliability of oral traditions. If Aboriginal Australians could remember coastlines from the end of the Ice Age, what might other cultures remember? Could the flood myths of Mesopotamia, Greece, India, and China also preserve real memories of lost lands? Could the legends of Atlantis, dismissed as Platonic fiction, encode fragments of genuine history, distorted and mythologized, but rooted in actual events? We cannot know for certain. But the Aboriginal example proves that oral tradition can preserve surprisingly accurate information across vast stretches of time. Memory, it seems, is longer than we thought. Picture the Sahara not as a desert, but as a savanna. Grasslands rolling to the horizon, dotted with acacia trees and thorn bushes. Herds of antelope grazing, elephants moving in slow procession toward a waterhole, giraffes browsing on branches that no longer exist. And scattered across this landscape, lakes, some shallow and ephemeral, drying up in the hot season and refilling with the rains. Others deep and permanent, fed by rivers that have long since vanished. This was the Sahara between approximately 10,000 and 5,000 BC, a period geologists call the African Humid Period. It was caused by shifts in Earth's orbital parameters, Milankovitch cycles, that altered the intensity of the African monsoon. Increased summer solar radiation strengthened the monsoon, bringing rain to regions that are now among the driest places on Earth. The change was dramatic. Pollen cores from lake beds show that vegetation spread across the Sahara. Animal bones, hippos, crocodiles, fish appear in sediment layers where now there is only sand. Rock art, carved and painted on cliff faces throughout the desert, depicts cattle herding, hunting scenes, dancing figures, boats in the Sahara. The images are unmistakable reed boats, wooden boats, vessels with multiple occupants, some with sails. They appear in regions where the nearest permanent water source today is hundreds of kilometers away. But during the African humid period, there was water. Lots of it. Lake Megachad, in what is now the Chad Basin, was larger than the Caspian Sea. Rivers flowed west from the highlands of Darfur, carving wadis that are now dry. The Nile received so much water from tributary systems that it flooded more extensively, depositing nutrient-rich silt across a wider floodplain. And people thrived. Archaeologists have found evidence of Neolithic settlements throughout the Sahara pottery: grinding stones, harpoon points, fishhooks. These were not nomadic hunter-gatherers in the traditional sense. They were semi-sedentary communities, some of whom experimented with domestication, herding cattle and goats, cultivating wild grains. They built stone structures. At Nabta Playa, as mentioned earlier, they erected megaliths, standing stones arranged in alignments, some weighing several tons. At other sites across the desert, stone circles, tombs, and cairns have been discovered, indicating a level of social organization and ritual practice that challenges our assumptions about pre-agricultural societies. Who were these people? We do not know their names. They left no writing. Their languages are extinct, but genetically, they are the ancestors of modern Saharan and sub-Saharan populations, and likely contributed to the populations that later settled in the Nile Valley. In other words, the people who built the megaliths at Nabta Playa may be the cultural ancestors of the Egyptians. And when the rains failed, when the monsoon weakened and the Sahara began to dry, they did not simply vanish. They migrated. They moved east toward the Nile, bringing with them their knowledge, their traditions, their rituals. The transition was not sudden. It took centuries, perhaps millennia. But by 3000 BCE, the Sahara was a desert. The lakes had dried up. The rivers had ceased to flow. The grasslands had turned to sand. And the people who had lived there were gone, absorbed into the emerging cultures of the Nile Valley and the Sahel, but they left traces. The cattle cult in pre-dynastic Egypt, the reverence for bulls, the use of cattle in ritual sacrifice may have origins in the herding cultures of the Green Sahara. The stone circles and alignments at Nabta Playa suggest an early tradition of astronomical observation and megalithic construction, a tradition that could have influenced the later builders of Egyptian temples and pyramids. We cannot prove a direct connection. The evidence is circumstantial, fragmentary, but it is tantalizing. It suggests that the roots of Egyptian civilization extend back farther than we thought, into a time when the desert was green, when the sky was watched, and when people who had no need for cities or writing nonetheless built monuments that have endured for 7,000 years. And it raises a question. If these Neolithic herders, with no bronze tools, no writing, no centralized government, could organize the construction of stone circles aligned to the stars, what else might they have built? What might still be hidden beneath the sand, waiting for the wind to shift, waiting for the desert to reveal its secrets once more? The stones stand in silence, half buried by drifting sand. They are not large, some are barely knee-high, weathered and cracked by thousands of years of desert sun. But they are arranged deliberately, placed upright in patterns that are clearly intentional. A circle, roughly 4 meters in diameter, with lines of stones extending outward like the spokes of a wheel. This is Nabta Playa, located in the Nubian desert, about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, near the border between Egypt and Sudan. The site was discovered in 1974 by a team of archaeologists surveying the region before the construction of a dam. What they found astonished them: evidence of a seasonal settlement dating back to at least 7,000 BCE, with hearths, pottery, animal bones, and most remarkably megalithic structures. The stone circle is the most famous feature. Excavations revealed that it was not built in a single phase, but evolved over centuries, with stones being added, moved, and realigned. The earliest phase dates to around 5000 BCE, making it one of the oldest known megalithic structures in the world, older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than almost any other stone monument on Earth. But age is not the most intriguing aspect of Nabta Playa. It is the alignment. In the 1990s, astronomers studying the site discovered that the stone circle is oriented to the cardinal directions with remarkable precision. Two of the stones mark a line that points directly north-south. Another pair marks a line aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. This means the builders of Nabta Playa understood celestial mechanics. They tracked the movement of the sun, observed the changing position of sunrise throughout the year, and used that knowledge to create a permanent marker, a calendar in stone. But there is more. Beneath some of the standing stones, archaeologists found something unexpected: buried rocks. Not random debris, but carefully shaped stones, deliberately placed in pits and then covered with megaliths. Some of these buried stones were sculpted into rough, rounded forms. One cluster was arranged in a pattern that, according to some researchers, mirrors the constellation Orion. This claim that Nabta Playa encodes a star map is controversial. Critics argue that the alignment is coincidental, that humans are prone to seeing patterns where none exist, that applying modern astronomical software to ancient sites can produce misleading results. But the correlation is striking. Orion held immense significance in later Egyptian cosmology. It was associated with Osiris, the god of death and rebirth, and the rising of Orion. S-belt stars marked the beginning of the Nile flood season, the most critical event in the agricultural calendar. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid are aligned with Orion and other stars. The layout of the three Giza pyramids has been argued by some to reflect the pattern of Orion's belt, though this too is debated. If the people of Nabta Playa were already tracking Orion in 5000 BCE, it suggests a continuous tradition of astronomical observation stretching across millennia, a tradition that predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. Who were these people? The mainstream view identifies them as Neolithic herders, pastoralists who migrated into the Sahara during the African humid period, following seasonal rains and grazing their cattle around temporary lakes. Nabta Playa was one such lake, a shallow basin that filled with water during the monsoon and dried out in the hot season. But these were not simple nomads. The effort required to quarry, transport, and erect megaliths, even small ones, is considerable. It requires planning, labor organization, and a shared purpose. The buried stones suggest ritual significance, a belief system complex enough to justify the effort of digging pits, shaping rocks, and covering them with standing stones. And the astronomical alignments suggest knowledge, systematic observation of the sky, passed down through generations, encoded into permanent markers so that future generations could continue the tradition. This is not the behavior of people living hand to mouth, struggling for survival. This is the behavior of a society with surplus, with leisure time, with cultural cohesion, strong enough to undertake communal projects that serve no immediate practical purpose. In other words, these people were on the threshold of civilization. They did not have writing. They did not have cities. But they had the capacity for abstraction, for long-term planning, for ritual and symbolism. And when the climate shifted, when the rains failed and the lakes dried up, they carried that capacity with them as they migrated eastward toward the Nile. Did they bring their stone-working knowledge, their astronomical traditions, their ritual practices? We cannot say for certain, but the parallels are suggestive. The solar alignment at Nabta Playa prefigures the solar alignments in Egyptian temples. The possible Orion correlation prefigures the Orion symbolism in pyramid architecture. The use of megaliths prefigures the stone monuments of dynastic Egypt. It is as if Nabta Playa is a prototype, a rough draft of ideas that will later be refined, expanded, and monumentalized along the Nile. And if that is true, then the story of Egypt does not begin with Narmer or the First Dynasty. It begins in the desert, under a sky filled with stars, with a group of herders who looked up and wondered, who marked the passage of time in stone, and who left behind the faintest echo of a civilization that almost was. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the sky, not in the way modern astronomers are with telescopes and equations, measuring redshifts and calculating orbits, but with the naked eye, with patience, with the slow accumulation of knowledge passed from priest to apprentice, generation after generation, until the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars were as familiar as the flooding of the Nile. The sky was their calendar. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when the star first becomes visible in the dawn sky after a period of invisibility, coincided almost exactly with the annual flood of the Nile. This astronomical event marked the beginning of the Egyptian year, the start of the agricultural cycle, the moment when life renewed itself. The sun's daily journey across the sky, rising in the east and setting in the west, was understood as the voyage of Ra, the sun god, traveling through the underworld at night and being reborn each morning. The stars that never set, the circumpolar stars that wheel around the North Pole without dipping below the horizon, were called the imperishable ones, associated with immortality and the afterlife. Temples were aligned with cardinal directions, oriented so that sunlight would penetrate the inner sanctum on specific days, solstices, equinoxes, the king's birthday. The walls of these temples were inscribed with star charts, calendars, ritual texts that invoked celestial powers. This is mainstream Egyptology, accepted by scholars worldwide. But some researchers argue that the Egyptians' astronomical knowledge went deeper, that they understood not just the yearly cycle of the sun and stars, but longer cycles spanning centuries or millennia. The most famous example is the so-called Orion correlation theory, proposed by Robert Bauval in the 1980s. Bauval noticed that the three pyramids of Giza Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure are not perfectly aligned in a straight row. The smallest pyramid, Menkaure's, is offset slightly to the east. This has always been known, but it was usually explained as a practical constraint. Perhaps the builders ran out of space or the bedrock was unsuitable. But Bauval saw something else. He realized that the layout of the three pyramids mirrors the pattern of the three stars in Orion, as Belt Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. Two stars are aligned, and the third is slightly offset, just as the pyramids are. Moreover, the Milky Way, which runs near Orion, corresponds roughly to the course of the Nile. Bauval proposed that the Giza Plateau was designed as a terrestrial reflection of the sky, a map of the heavens rendered in stone. The theory was met with both fascination and skepticism. Critics pointed out that the correlation is not perfect, that applying modern star charts to ancient monuments can be misleading, and that cherry-picking alignments can produce false patterns. The mainstream consensus remains that while the Egyptians certainly incorporated astronomical alignments into their architecture, the Orion correlation is likely coincidental or overstated. But the idea opened a door. It suggested that the Egyptians might have been thinking in terms of cosmic architecture, that their monuments were not just tombs or temples, but symbols, representations of a celestial order they sought to mirror on Earth. And then there is precession. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, caused by gravitational interactions with the sun and moon. It takes approximately 26,000 years for one complete cycle. As a result, the position of the stars relative to the horizon changes over time. The North Star today is Polaris, but 5,000 years ago, the North Star was Thuban in the constellation Draco. The ancient Greeks knew about precession. Hipparchus is credited with discovering it in the 2nd century BCE. But did the Egyptians know? There is no explicit mention of precession in Egyptian texts. But some researchers argue that certain myths and symbols encode awareness of it, references to the turning of the sky, the bending of the heavens, the idea that the cosmos undergoes vast cycles of time. If the Egyptians observed the sky carefully over many generations, they could have noticed that the stars shifted slightly. A priest in 3000 BCE, who consulted records from 4000 BCE, would see that the stars no longer rose at the same points on the horizon. Over 1,000 years, the change is small but detectable. And if they detected it, what did they make of it? Some alternative theorists, most notably Graham Hancock, have suggested that the Sphinx and other monuments encode a specific epocha Zep Tepi, or first time, when the gods ruled and the world was created. By using precession to date when the Sphinx's gaze would have aligned with the constellation Leo at the spring equinox, some researchers propose a date around 10,500 BCE. This is highly speculative and rejected by mainstream Egyptology. The idea that monuments encode dates thousands of years before they were supposedly built requires accepting that the builders possessed knowledge we have no evidence for. Yet the question lingers: why did the Egyptians care so deeply about the stars? Why did they align their pyramids with such precision? Why did they carve star charts onto tomb ceilings and temple walls? Perhaps it was purely religious, a belief that the soul ascended to the stars, that the pharaoh became a god and joined the imperishable ones in the northern sky. Or perhaps it was something more, a sense that the cosmos operated on cycles larger than any single lifetime, and that by building monuments aligned with those cycles, they were participating in something eternal, something that transcended the brief flicker of human existence. Stone, after all, endures. Stars endure. And by linking the two, by inscribing the heavens into the earth, the builders ensured that their legacy would outlast empires, outlast languages, outlast even memory itself. The stars would remember, even if humanity forgot. Imagine trying to explain to someone in 3000 BC that the stars move. Not the obvious movement, the nightly arc from east to west, caused by Earth's rotation, but the slow drift, the almost imperceptible shift in position that occurs over centuries. That the constellations your great-great-grandfather saw are not quite where you see them. That the North Star your ancestors used for navigation will eventually cease to be the North Star. How would you explain precession to a culture without telescopes, without calculus, without even a concept of Earth as a rotating sphere in space? You would use stone. Stone is humanity's most reliable method of encoding information across vast stretches of time. Paper decays. Clay tablets shatter. Metal corrodes. But stone, granite, basalt, limestone endures for millennia if properly cared for. A message carved in stone can outlast civilizations. And if you wanted to encode astronomical knowledge, that took centuries to accumulate. Stone monuments aligned with celestial markers would be the most logical choice. This is one interpretation of megalithic structures worldwide, that they are observatories, calendars, records of astronomical phenomena preserved in the most permanent medium available. Stonehenge, for instance, is aligned with the summer solstice. On the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly over the heel stone, casting a beam of light into the center of the monument. Thousands of people gathered there then, just as tourists gather there now to witness the alignment. But Stonehenge is more than a solstice marker. Recent research suggests it also tracks lunar cycles, the 18.6-year cycle during which the moon's rising and setting positions shift along the horizon. By marking these positions with stones, the builders created a predictive tool, a way of forecasting eclipses and other lunar events. This required observation spanning decades, perhaps centuries. It required a stable culture, a community committed to maintaining and updating the monument over multiple generations. The same is true of Nabta Playa, of the stone circles in Scotland, of the megalithic sites in Brittany and Malta. These were not built overnight. They evolved generation by generation as knowledge accumulated and was encoded into stone. And Egypt? The pyramids are oriented to the cardinal directions with astonishing precision. The Great Pyramid's sides are aligned to true north, to within a fraction of a degree and accuracy that modern surveyors struggle to match. How did the Egyptians achieve this without magnetic compasses? They used the stars. One method, described by later Greek writers, involves tracking circumpolar stars as they rotate around the celestial pole. By marking the rising and setting positions of a star over the course of a night, you can bisect the angle to find true north. It requires patience and clear skies, but no advanced technology. Another method involves using a merkhet, an Egyptian tool consisting of a plumb line and a sighting bar, to observe stars as they transit the meridian, the imaginary line running from north to south through the zenith. When a star crosses the meridian, it is due south or north, depending on which direction you face. By recording these transits, you can map the sky with precision. These techniques are well documented in later Egyptian texts and are accepted by mainstream scholars as plausible explanations for pyramid alignments. But here's where things get speculative. Some researchers argue that certain alignments are too precise, too consistent across different dynasties, to be the result of trial and error. They suggest that the Egyptians possessed standardized methods, perhaps even instruments, that have since been lost. Others point to anomalies alignments that do not make sense unless you account for precession. For example, the southern shaft in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid is angled at approximately 45 degrees and points toward a region of the sky that, around 2500 BCE, would have been occupied by the stars of Orion's belt. But if you calculate where those stars were positioned thousands of years earlier, during the epoch when some researchers believe the Sphinx was carved, the alignment becomes even more precise. This is the foundation of the Giza correlation theory, the idea that the monuments encode a date far older than the 4th dynasty, a date embedded in their astronomical alignments. Mainstream Egyptologists dismiss this as numerology, as retrofitting data to support a preconceived conclusion. And they may be right. Astronomical alignments are notoriously easy to misinterpret. With enough creativity, you can find correlations between almost any monument and some celestial feature. But the fact remains, the Egyptians cared deeply about the stars, and they built their monuments with those stars in mind. Whether they understood precession is still debated. Whether they deliberately encoded dates spanning tens of thousands of years is highly unlikely. But they did understand that the cosmos operated on cycles daily, monthly, yearly, and that stone was the best way to preserve that knowledge. Time, measured in stone, becomes eternal. And perhaps that was the point. Not to communicate specific information to distant descendants, but to participate in the eternal, to build something that would stand as long as the stars themselves. A testament to the human capacity to observe, to measure, to create meaning from the vast, indifferent cosmos. The stones remain, the stars remain, and the question remains, how much did they know? There is a strange paradox at the heart of the pyramids. They are monuments built to defy time, to endure forever, to proclaim the immortality of the pharaohs who commissioned them. Yet they are built from limestone, a sedimentary rock formed from the compressed remains of ancient sea creatures. Press your hand against a block in the Great Pyramid, and you are touching fossils, shells, coral fragments, the mineralized skeletons of organisms that lived more than 50 million years ago, when the entire region was submerged beneath a shallow tropical sea. The Egyptians knew this. They had to. They quarried the stone, shaped it, fitted it into place. They would have seen the fossils embedded in the rock's spiraled shells, imprints of ancient sea life. Did they wonder what they were? Did they recognize them as the remains of living creatures? Or did they interpret them as symbols, omens, gifts from the gods? We do not know. Egyptian texts do not discuss fossils. But the fact that they built their greatest monuments from stone that preserves evidence of deep time of ages when the world was utterly different is a profound irony. The pyramids are made of ancient seas. Limestone forms in marine environments. Calcium carbonate dissolved from shells and coral precipitates out of seawater and settles in layers on the ocean floor. Over millions of years, these layers compress and harden into rock. The Mokattam Formation, from which much of the Giza limestone was quarried, dates to the Eocene epoch, roughly 50 million years ago, when Egypt was covered by the Tethys Sea, a predecessor to the modern Mediterranean. This means that the stones of the pyramids are far older than human civilization. They are geological artifacts, remnants of a time when dinosaurs had only recently gone extinct, when mammals were just beginning to diversify, when continents were still drifting into their current positions. The Egyptians took this ancient material and shaped it into something new. They transformed the seabed into monuments. But there is another layer to this story, one that ventures into more speculative territory. Some alternative researchers have suggested that not all the blocks in the pyramids were freshly quarried. They argue that certain stones, particularly the granite blocks in the king's chamber, and the casing stones that once covered the pyramid's exterior, may have been reused from earlier structures. The evidence for this is circumstantial. Some blocks show wear patterns inconsistent with their current position. Others have tool marks that do not match the tools known from the 4th dynasty. And then there are the casing stones, the smooth, white Tura limestone that once covered the pyramid, making it gleam like a polished gem. Most of these casing stones were removed in the Middle Ages, carted off to build mosques and palaces in Cairo. But a few remain at the base of the pyramid, and they are fitted together with extraordinary precision joints, so tight that a razor blade cannot fit between them. Could these stones have been salvaged from older structures that predated the 4th dynasty? There is no direct evidence, no inscriptions, no archaeological context to support the idea. But the hypothesis raises an intriguing question. If earlier cultures built in stone along the Nile, what happened to their monuments? Stone can be repurposed. It is heavy, difficult to transport, but once quarried and shaped, it is a valuable resource. Later builders often dismantled older structures to obtain ready-made blocks, especially if the original monuments had been abandoned or lost their religious significance. If the Egyptians did this, if they reused granite beams, casing stones, even entire architectural elements from pre-dynastic structures, we would have no way of knowing. The stones themselves do not carry dates. Their fossils tell us when the limestone formed, but not when it was quarried or when it was placed in the pyramid. And so the paradox remains. The pyramids are built from stone that is millions of years old in a land that was once beneath the sea by a culture that may have inherited techniques and materials from an even older past. The fossils whisper of deep time. The stones whisper of forgotten builders. And the pyramids themselves, silent and monumental, stand as a bridge between ages, between the ancient seas and the desert, between prehistory and history, between what we know and what we can only imagine. If you could drain the Mediterranean, if you could lower sea levels by 100 meters and expose the continental shelves that are now submerged, you would see a different map of the ancient world. Islands that are now separated would be connected by land bridges. Shallow seas would become fertile plains. Coastlines would extend tens or even hundreds of kilometers beyond their current positions. And you would see ruins. This is not speculation. We know from sonar surveys and underwater archaeology that large portions of the ancient world are now beneath the sea. The reasons are twofold: sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, and subsidence, the gradual sinking of coastal land due to sediment compaction, tectonic activity, or human interference. The most famous examples are in the Mediterranean. Off the coast of Alexandria, divers had discovered the submerged ruins of ancient harbors, palaces, and temples. Some date to the time of Cleopatra, submerged by a combination of earthquakes and rising seas. Others are older remnants of structures built during the Ptolemaic period, now lying beneath meters of water and silt. In 2000, French archaeologist Frank Gaudio located the lost cities of Heracleion and Canopus in Aboukir Bay, near Alexandria. These were major ports during the late Pharaonic and Ptolemaic periods, described in ancient texts but lost for over a millennium. They had sunk into the sea drowned by rising water levels, buried under sediment. Gaudio's team found statues, inscriptions, temple ruins, entire streets still partially intact, preserved by the water. It was a stunning discovery, proof that major cities can vanish completely and remain hidden for thousands of years. But Heracleion and Canopus are historical cities. We know they existed because ancient writers mentioned them. What about cities that predate writing? The Nile Delta, where the river empties into the Mediterranean, is one of the most geologically active regions in Egypt. It is a massive fan of sediment, deposited over millions of years, constantly shifting as the river changes course. Sea levels have fluctuated dramatically over the millennia. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, the delta extended much farther north. The coastline was dozens of kilometers beyond its current position. If people lived in the delta during that time, if they built settlements, even monuments, those sites would now be underwater, buried beneath sediment, effectively invisible to archaeologists. And there are hints that such settlements existed. Pre-dynastic artifacts have been found in the delta pottery, tools, tombs dating back to 4000 BCE and earlier. But the record is sparse, fragmented. Much of the delta has never been systematically surveyed because it is covered by modern cities, farmland, and thick layers of silt. Some researchers argue that the delta was the true birthplace of Egyptian civilization, that the earliest experiments in writing, governance, and monumental architecture occurred there, only to be lost when the region flooded. If true, this would explain the seemingly sudden emergence of a fully developed Egyptian state around 3100 BCE. It would not be sudden at all, just the culmination of centuries of development in a region where the evidence has been washed away. But the delta is not the only area of concern. All around the Mediterranean, along the coasts of the Levant, Turkey, Greece, and North Africa, there are submerged landscapes that were dry land during the Ice Age. Some have been explored. Underwater surveys off the coast of Israel have found stone tools and structures in depths up to 10 meters, dated to the Neolithic period. Others remain unexplored, either because they are too deep, too silted over, or because no one has thought to look. And then there is the Persian Gulf. During the Ice Age, the Gulf was largely dry. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization, flowed through a broad valley where the Gulf now lies, emptying into the ocean much farther south. This valley, known as the Gulf Oasis, would have been a fertile, resource-rich environment, ideal for human settlement. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, the Gulf filled in. The process took several thousand years, but by around 5000 BCE, the valley was completely submerged. If people lived there, if they built villages, if they farmed, if they developed early forms of social organization, all evidence of their existence is now beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. Some researchers, most notably Jeffrey Rose, have proposed that memories of the Gulf inundation may have inspired the Mesopotamian flood myths, that the stories of a world-destroying deluge preserve cultural memories of rising seas swallowing the land. It is an elegant hypothesis, though difficult to prove. Underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf is challenging due to silt, depth, and political instability in the region. But it remains one of the most tantalizing possibilities in the search for lost civilizations. We tend to think of the ancient world as fully explored, fully mapped, fully known. But the truth is, we have only scratched the surface literally. Vast areas of the seabed remain unsurveyed. Entire coastlines that were inhabited during the Ice Age are now submerged. If we want to find the earliest origins of civilization, we may need to look not in the desert, but beneath the waves. The sea keeps its secrets well, but it also preserves them, locked in sediment, waiting for the right technology, the right questions, the right moment to reveal what has been hidden for 10,000 years. In 1968, a scuba diver named Nicholas Fleming was exploring the waters off the southern coast of Greece when he found something impossible: stone walls, paved streets. The ruins of buildings, lying in shallow water, covered in algae and sand. He had discovered Pavlopetri, a Bronze Age city, submerged around 1000 BCE, perfectly preserved beneath the waves. Pavlopetri is not unique. Off the coast of Israel, near the modern city of Haifa, archaeologists have found the submerged village of Adlit Yam, dated to around 7000 BCE. The site includes stone houses, a well, and a stone circle, possibly used for ritual purposes. The preservation is extraordinary. Wooden tools, human skeletons, even plant remains have been recovered, offering a snapshot of Neolithic life rarely found on land. In the Black Sea, underwater surveys have discovered shipwrecks and settlements dating back thousands of years, some preserved in the anoxic, oxygen-free deep waters where decay is slowed to a crawl. And in the shallow waters around Malta, divers have reported what appear to be megalithic structures, straight lines of stones, angular formations lying on the seabed. The claims are controversial, not yet confirmed by formal archaeological surveys, but if verified, they would push the history of construction in the Mediterranean back even further. The point is this: the sea is not a barrier to archaeology. It is an archive. Ancient cities do not disappear, they sink. And when they sink, they are often better preserved than structures on land, protected from wind, weathering, and human interference. We are only just beginning to explore this underwater archive. Sonar technology, remotely operated vehicles, and improved diving techniques are opening up new frontiers in archaeology. How many other cities are waiting to be found? How many settlements, monuments, entire cultures lie beneath the waves, preserved in the dark, cold waters of the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the North Sea? The answer is, we do not know. But every new discovery suggests that the ancient world was far larger, far more complex than the evidence on land alone would suggest. The sea remembers what the land has forgotten. There is a moment in every civilization's history when something extraordinary happens. Someone makes a mark that means something. Not a picture, not decoration, but a symbol and abstract representation of a sound, a word, an idea. A mark that can be read, interpreted, passed on to someone who was not there when it was made. This is writing. And it changes everything. Before writing, knowledge is fragile. It depends on memory, on oral tradition, on the unbroken chain of teacher and student. A single catastrophe, a plague, a famine, a war can sever that chain, and entire bodies of knowledge can be lost. But after writing, knowledge becomes durable. It can be stored, copied, transmitted across time and space. A text written 3,000 years ago can still be read today, its author's voice preserved in ink on papyrus or carved into stone. Yet writing is a recent invention. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Anatomically modern humans, with brains identical to ours, have lived for at least 50,000 years, possibly longer. Writing, however, is only about 5,500 years old. The earliest known writing systems appear almost simultaneously in Mesopotamia, Sumerian cuneiform, around 3400 BCE, and Egypt, hieroglyphs, around 3200 BCE. China developed writing independently around 1200 BCE. Mesoamerica developed writing around 900 BCE. For 95% of human history, there was no writing. Just speech, gesture, art, ritual methods of communication that leave no permanent record. This creates a profound bias in how we understand the past. We divide human history into prehistory, before writing, and history, after writing. But this division is arbitrary, a product of our dependence on texts. It implies that nothing significant happened before writing, that the thousands of generations who lived and died without leaving written records somehow lived less meaningful, less complex lives. But this is absurd. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had no writing. The people who painted the caves of Lascaux and Altamira had no writing. The people who settled the Pacific Islands, who domesticated crops in the Amazon, who tracked game across the steppes of Central Asia, none of them had writing. Yet they were not primitive. They had language, mythology, social structures, technologies. They possessed vast bodies of knowledge about plants, animals, weather patterns, navigation, medicine knowledge accumulated over thousands of years and transmitted orally. When writing finally appeared, it did not replace oral tradition. It supplemented it. For centuries, most people remained illiterate. Knowledge was still passed down through apprenticeship, through song, through ritual. Writing was a tool used by scribes, priests, and administrators, a specialized skill, not a universal one. But over time, written texts became the dominant form of record-keeping, and cultures that did not develop writing, or whose writing systems were lost vanished from history. This is why we know so much about Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. They left texts. They recorded their kings, their wars, their gods. We can read their words, reconstruct their languages, trace their genealogies. But what about the cultures that came before? The Neolithic farmers who built the megaliths of Western Europe? The pastoralists of the Green Sahara? The coastal peoples whose settlements are now underwater? They are silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they left no texts for us to read. And this silence is dangerous. It leads us to underestimate them, to assume that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. But oral traditions can preserve astonishing amounts of information. We have already discussed the Aboriginal Australians, whose stories accurately describe coastlines from 7,000 years ago. But there are other examples. The Hindu Veda sacred texts composed in Sanskrit were transmitted orally for thousands of years before being written down. Trained priests memorized tens of thousands of verses, preserving them with such precision that regional variations are almost non-existent. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific Islands did so without maps or compasses, relying instead on oral knowledge passed down through generations' knowledge of stars, currents, wave patterns, bird behavior. This knowledge was so precise that modern sailors, using the same techniques, have successfully replicated the ancient voyages. If oral tradition can preserve such detailed information, what might it have preserved about the deep past? Could the myths of lost civilizations, Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu be distorted memories of real places, real cultures that thrived before writing and were forgotten when the climate changed or the seas rose? Most scholars are skeptical. Myths evolve, they argue. They are not reliable historical records. The story of Atlantis, for instance, appears in Plato's dialogues, written in the 4th century BCE, and is widely regarded as a philosophical allegory, not historical account. But Plato claimed he was repeating a story told to the Greek statesman Solon by Egyptian priests who, Solon said, maintained records stretching back thousands of years. Could there be a kernel of truth in the story? A memory of a Bronze Age civilization destroyed by natural disaster, or even an Ice Age culture lost to rising seas, distorted and mythologized over millennia. We will never know for certain. The silence before writing is absolute. But it is worth remembering that silence does not mean absence. It means only that we have lost the ability to hear. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the candle's reach, entire chapters of human history are waiting, chapters written not in ink or stone, but in the fragile medium of memory, preserved in myths and legends, waiting for us to learn how to listen again. Picture the candle again. It burns in the darkness, casting light on a small patch of stone hieroglyphs, perhaps, or the smooth face of a limestone block, or the weathered features of a sphinx gazing eastward. The flame flickers. Shadows stretch and shrink. And beyond the circle of light, the darkness waits, vast and patient. This is how we know the ancient world. In fragments, in glimpses, in brief, uncertain moments of illumination, surrounded by enormous voids of unknowing. We have found pyramids and temples, tombs and papyri, pottery and tools. We have deciphered languages, reconstructed chronologies, mapped trade routes, analyzed bones and seeds and pollen. We have built a narrative of human civilization, rising from Stone Age villages to bronze-working kingdoms to empires that spanned continents. But the story is incomplete. For every site we have excavated, 100 remain buried. For every text we have translated, 1,000 were lost, burned, rotted, crumbled to dust. For every monument that survives, entire cities have vanished beneath sand, beneath water, beneath modern construction. And the farther back we look, the darker it becomes. The Egyptians knew this. Their own mythology speaks of a time before the pharaohs, a first time when the gods walked the earth, when the world was younger and knowledge flowed more freely. Whether this was historical memory or religious allegory, we cannot say, but it reflects an awareness that their civilization was not the beginning, that something came before. And the same is true for every civilization. Each one builds on the ruins of what came before, inheriting techniques, adapting ideas, repurposing stones. The Romans built with Greek designs. The Greeks learned from the Phoenicians and Egyptians. The Egyptians inherited knowledge from the Neolithic cultures of the Nile Valley and the Sahara. And those cultures, in turn, descended from Ice Age hunter-gatherers who tracked the stars, carved stone, and told stories around fires that went out 10,000 years ago. The chain stretches back, link by link, into the darkness. And somewhere, far back, the chain ends, or rather, it fades into invisibility, into the silence before writing, the shadows before history. But the darkness is not empty. It is filled with echoes, myths, and legends, anomalous erosion patterns, drill marks that puzzle engineers, megaliths aligned with stars, flood stories that span continents. These are the whispers of the past, faint and fragmentary, hinting at stories we have not yet learned to hear. We cannot know with certainty what lies hidden in that darkness. We cannot prove that lost civilizations existed, that ancient cultures possessed knowledge we have forgotten, that the Sphinx or the pyramids or the megaliths encode secrets from ages older than we can imagine. But we can ask. We can look at the erosion on the Sphinx and wonder if it remembers rain. We can stand at Nabta Playa and imagine the people who raised those stones under a sky full of stars. We can dive into the Mediterranean and explore the ruins of cities that vanished beneath the waves, and we can wonder how many others remain unfound. We can acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge, the coastlines now underwater, the settlements buried by sand, the oral traditions lost when the last speaker died without an heir. We can recognize that our understanding of the ancient world is not complete, not certain, and that new discoveries like Göbekli Tepe, like the submerged ruins off Greece and Israel, like the Aboriginal stories that preserve 7,000-year-old geography, can change everything. The candle flickers, the light shifts, and in that shift, we glimpse something new, a carving we had not noticed, a shadow that suggests another chamber, a possibility we had not considered. This is the work of archaeology, of history, of storytelling. To push the light a little farther, to illuminate one more patch of stone, to ask one more question and see where it leads. And sometimes in the asking we discover that the darkness is not a void, but a presence, that the ancient world is not dead, but waiting, patient and silent beneath the sands and seas, beneath the weight of millennia, holding its secrets until we are ready to listen. The candle burns, the stone endures. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the light, the ancient world watches and waits. If you found yourself drawn into these shadows, if the flicker of the candle has stirred your curiosity, consider staying a while longer. There are more stories to be told, more mysteries to explore, more questions waiting at the edge of time. Until then, the flame will keep burning, and the ancient world, seen by candlelight, will continue to reveal itself one shadow at a time.